Hi, this is Jellycode, and today we're going to be discussing Chapter 3, Level Layout, and Spawn Points. Now, on to our level layout. So our level layout currently is a big box and a floor, tile map of a floor, which uses one of our sprites, which is Dungeon Floor. Now, let's first go on how our enemies spawn. Our spawn point. So our spawn point, it has 4 spawnable tiles where the enemy can spawn, and it's always going to be attached to the player, as you can see here when I start it. That it's going to always be attached to the player wherever it goes. As you see, this part is still on the player, and regardless of where the player goes, it still shows the spawn point following the player. Now, why did we do this? We did this so even if the player is far away, the enemies will still spawn beside him, as that's how roguelike survival games work. Well, now you might be asking, how do we spawn the enemies in the spawn points? Well, we have a wave manager here, which handles the enemy spawns and what type of enemy can spawn. And how it handles it is it goes into the list, and then it shuffles from the list, and then it chooses one of the 4 spawn points on where to spawn each enemies. Now, let's go towards the script on how the code works. Now moving on to our wave spawner script. We have a lot of variables here. This is for the prefabs, this is to get the spawn points, this is for where the player is, and this is for the reward manager. It counts how many waves there is, how much time in between waves are, and this is just when the player is choosing after the wave of some of the reward they're gonna get. And this just tracks how many enemies are in the level at the moment, so it doesn't get overloaded, or just tracks when it goes 0, it ends the wave, and it makes the choosing reward true. So let's talk about the spawn wave. Now, here you might be confused, like this just waits until choosing reward is false. Now, on to is boss wave. Now, is boss wave only becomes true when wave number is divisible by 5, which in this case, it spawns the boss every 5th wave as it is divisible by 5. So, in the enemy spawn wave, after enemy count, here we check for if it's a boss or not. Well, in this case, if it's a boss wave, and it'll have just one enemy count if it's a boss wave, and it'll ensure that will be shown in a later code that the only spawning here is a boss. And for this part of the code, it'll be just how it spawns for the enemies, and always wait for 0.5 seconds before spawning a new enemy, so it won't crash when you're in like wave 100, as there's gonna be too many enemies, as our wave numbers is incremental to how many enemies we spawn. So it's better if we spawn them at a slower pace than just slapping them all in the level layout. Now, next is our yield return. This just checks if there are any more active enemies, And if there are no more active enemies, it continues down the code and then makes choosing reward true, which shows our reward screen that will be shown later on, and our reward panels to be set to true, and also increases our wave number by 1. Well, in this case, increments by 1. Now, spawn enemy. This checks for if the boss wave is true or false. This just confirms if there are spawn points and enemy that has been declared in the system, like here. As if there's none, it will return null, and since there is, it will continue down the code line. Now, for our spawn points, this just checks for these spawn points that are shown here, and after checks, of course, it will check for spawn point 1, 2, 3 with their corresponding elements, and if there is, then it'll make it as variable. Same with the enemy prefab. If it is a boss wave, if it's a boss wave, then it'll just show up the boss, and if it's not, then it shows the enemy prefabs that could be spawned from here. Now, what are the enemy prefabs that are being shown here? Well, first of all, enemy prefabs are what I've showed, and enemy types are here. So basically, this public enum is just a list of different types, enemy types that could spawn, except for the boss, since the boss is always going to spawn during a spawn wave, but it cannot spawn during an enemy type wave. And after that, we declare enemy and instantiate it as a prefab, where it will spawn at a spawn point with looking in our camera and having the prefab of our sprite. And it also adds 1 to the active enemy count in the scene. Next is select enemy type. Now, this corresponds to here, as this checks if it's a boss wave. Since waves 1 to 4 is not, it'll call this constantly until enemies are 0. And this select enemy type is just a random, just makes random numbers, well, random values, and spawns in basic, fast, tank, and shooters like seen here in enemy type. So now, with these values, rand and 0.4, so basic is going to always be 40%, so it'll spawn more consistently than fast, then tank, and shooter, but fast will spawn with different values, which will be seen in the enemy spawn type later on in chapters, and then shooters. And then after that is going to be our enemy defeat, which just removes enemy from active enemies. And then resume wave just closes the reward menu, and when the reward menu is closed, the game is continued again and the waves spawn again. And next is on to our chapter 4, where we will be discussing anything related to our player movements and projectiles.